Scott just made the point.
Jefferson used to be a lot more secure, not just.
Welcome to America, the land of liberty, where you're free. Free to be quarantined on suspicion of disease. I'm PJTV's Scott Ott, joined now by Stephen Green and Bill Whittle. And men, Kaci Hickox just got back from Sierra Leone, where she nursed Ebola patients. And while passing through New Jersey on her way home to Maine, Kaci suddenly became the woman in the plastic bubble. She was confined for 3 days against her will in a tent in a hospital parking lot with a portable toilet and no shower. That's because New Jersey has a mandatory quarantine policy, and Kaci fit at least part of the profile to be hermetically sealed for our protection. Now, as it turns out, Kaci does not have Ebola. She says the skin surface thermometer indicated she was running hot due to the grilling she got from authorities at the airport. The ACLU raised a ruckus, and Kaci headed home to Maine, where despite testing negative twice for Ebola, she still faces 17 more days of quarantine, but probably at home this time. Now, Stephen Green, let me give you a scenario. The phone rings at Casa Verde, and the fetching Mrs. Green picks it up. It seems that one of the Green Mountain Boys played with the new Liberian kid at school. And that Liberian kid now has a fever. Your son is in Colorado state custody and won't be coming home anytime soon. Who gets to decide whether and where to quarantine? The government or you? And before you answer, if it's you, doesn't this just prove that your libertarianism could lead to a disastrous epidemic of Ebola?
Yeah, it's one of those times where principles rub up against the real world, and I don't care where you stand on the political spectrum. If at some point your principles don't rub up against the real world, then I'm going to say you're probably not getting out into the real world very often. Like, this is one of those things. Government is supposed to be able to do things well, a few things well, and one of those is to protect us from infectious disease, from becoming a pandemic. So yeah, there should be some sort of quarantine power available, especially when you have something as deadly as Ebola. Like they say, we've lost 15,000 people already in West Africa, and the number may actually be 10 times higher than that already, or at least before this whole thing is over. So we are talking about a dangerous disease here. But one of the reasons we have a small and limited government is so when the government does exercise some of these extraordinary powers like quarantine, we can trust it to do so in a rational manner, and we can hold them accountable later at the ballot box if they do not. Instead, we have this Leviathan government who we do not trust to do these very simple, basic things correctly, and that gets people doing stupid things, which increases the risk of an actual pandemic, and it also increases the risk of government abuse. So we're in a bad spot here on this one.
Well, Bill Whittle, as the old saying goes, my liberty to swing my fist ends where your nose begins. Aren't you glad that your government preemptively protects you like this? I mean, after all, what's one woman's liberty compared with a potential health risk to the community? Or do you agree with those liberals at the ACLU that New Jersey had no right to detain Kaci Hickox?
One thing I'm a little concerned about in terms of the structure of society would be what would happen if there was a epidemic outbreak of actual freedom. I don't know if people would be able to handle that. This is actually a perfectly interesting question, Scotty. It's a really good question, because this is the question that does in fact hit the fault lines between what is personal interest and what is communal interest. Now, we tend to be conservatives or libertarians. I'm starting to call myself a conservatarian, and I tend to come down very strongly on individual freedoms and limited powers of the government. So I'll tell you how I think this case should have been handled. I think we do have an interest in protecting the public health. Your ability to swing your fist ends at my nose or whatever the statement is, but you know, if it turns out that you are sneezing in my face, even though we don't have any evidence that it's borne by particles, all of a sudden I have a dog in this hunt. So I think the answer is actually something a little more appropriate, something along the lines of this. I think if she had come from a country where Ebola was known to have broken out and she was exhibiting some of the symptoms, then instead of being put in a plastic tent with a portable toilet, she should have been taken to a hospital where Ebola tests should have been on hand and ready to go. This test should have been done within 3 or 4 hours. She could have been proven negative within 3 or 4 hours and sent on her way. So you can, in fact, have a world where you do have to meet some of these minimal obligations for public safety, and yet at the same time treat people with the dignity and the sense of their own private individual worth to make sure that if you have to take this step, you release them as soon as possible. This is basically how we do arrests, right? We arrest people because there's probable cause. You're not supposed to just arrest people on the street, but if you have probable cause to believe that that person has committed a crime, then the state empowers you to bring that person in for questioning, but they can't be held forever. They have to pretty quickly be charged with something or let go. So if she's showing Ebola symptoms coming from a country that has Ebola, take her to a hospital, put her in a hospital quarantine with an indoor bathroom with running plumbing, make her comfortable, give her a test, and if 3 hours, if she proves negative, get her out of there.
Well, in a perfect world, we would know all that there is to know about Ebola. In a nearly perfect world, healthcare professionals like Kaci Hickox would volunteer to quarantine themselves because we don't know all that there is to know about Ebola or about her condition specifically. In the real world, politicians would rather offend a few to be seen as protecting the many. But let's not be too hard on the politicians. After all, most of them are, sadly, reflections of us. The problem with trusting people, even doctors and nurses, is that they don't always use good judgment. The problem with trusting government is that it's composed of people. Now, many of us might say, give me liberty or give me death. But how many of us would say, I'll give you liberty, even if it might give me death? For Bill Whittle, Stephen Green, and the entire Trifecta crew at PJTV.com, I'm Scott Ott.